Americans and 77% of those of us who believe the Bible is true and the Word of God believe we're now living in biblical end times. And I hear a lot of talk about it, not only in America, but wherever I travel around the world. I'm friends with Joel Rosenberg. I'm talk to a lot of other ministry leaders and people in other parts of the world, and they just sense that there's a time of great uncertainty. I've read an economic chart just recently prepared by a friend out of Singapore who showed that the intensity of crises are much greater right now than they've been in the last 50 years. So that's an unsettling feeling for so many of us. And we look at culture, certainly it's upside down. I see a time when truth has become a lie and lies become the truth. That's talked about in the Scripture. Mm-hmm. I also think about 1 Timothy 3, when Paul said, in the end times there will be terrible days. He said people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, and lovers of pleasure. And that's the cultural mantra. That's the worldview of where the culture is headed. And they're angry if Christians don't support that worldview and we don't go along with it. So I think that where I differ from others, Kirby, is that I think it's very healthy to keep a long-term view of life. Contrary to saying I'm going to capitulate, I'm going to give up, I'm not going to try to speak out on issues, I'm not going to buy life insurance. I think it was John Wesley who said when he was asked, what would you do if you knew today was the last day of history, if today was the final day of history? And he said, I would plant a tree. And essentially what he was saying was, I will carry on doing what I'm supposed to be doing as a steward here on earth. I'm a fan of Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, and he has a great line about the end times. I've actually been reading through his eschatology chapter, and he says he recommends we commit ourselves to long-term activities. So he agrees with John Wesley that to be ready means we're carrying out our purpose that God put us here on earth today. There's no reason to panic. We know that we're victors in the end. We're nearing Easter, as we all know, and the ultimate victory is our Savior conquered death. So we have nothing to fear. I do believe that whatever God gave us to do, we need to continue doing. That's why, let me just mention, Kirby, I would support your program as one who is putting out the truth, and I would encourage people to say, join the Truth Team 360, because what we need is truth. The end times is marked by a great delusion, and the counterbalance to delusion is the truth. And the truth is what will prepare people. The truth is our greatest asset, Kirby. The Bible talks about those who have hoarded silver and gold, they will all corrode. And he even talks about in James that to our shame we hoarded money in the end times, as opposed to investing it in the kingdom where it could have done some good. That's the only long-term return on investment, is to give and to build the kingdom of God.
I've also heard in that quote that some have said, he said, plant a tree and pay your debts. And that's another part of that, because it illustrates the fact that we should really be good citizens. No matter whatever happens, we obey those in government, we pray for those in government, and we recognize that we are to be good citizens. And certainly one aspect of that is to pay our debts. And we're going to be talking about that in just a minute as well. So let me take a break, and Chuck Bentley with us. And always we encourage you to find out a little bit more about the ministry that he is involved with. So as you click on his picture there, it will take you to crown.org, and you will find all sorts of resources there that we certainly commend to you. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to address some of those issues, certainly as we face the end times. But I also want to get to another piece that was written by Chuck, and that is the founder's fear of the federal debt. We got talking about that last week with Mike Ferris during our Truth Team Week, and it was striking to, first of all, realize how much online debt there is, but there's a lot of debt off the books. And is that what the framers intended? Well, I think you know the answer to that, but I think it also helps us understand that at these perilous times, we need to really consider what are our high priorities in terms of our family, in terms of our faith, in terms of our freedom. And that's what we certainly talk about so often here on Point of View. So let's take a break. We'll come back, and Chuck will be with us, but also pretty soon I'll open up the phones because I suspect you might have comments or questions about some of the issues we're talking about. So stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
You know, perhaps homosexual activists believe that they have been victorious and can now be more honest about their agenda. In the past, many would deny there's a gay agenda. Now they're talking about it openly. At least they're talking about it in Canada. Bear Bergman is a Canadian activist who recently said he was tired of hiding his true agenda. He said, "I am here to tell you, all the time I said I wasn't indoctrinating anyone with my beliefs about gay and lesbian and bi and trans and queer people, that was a lie." As the head of a Toronto publishing company, he was taught how to use soft language when talking about homosexuality. He was not to betray his real goal, which was to recruit kids into the lifestyle. He wanted those kids to actually disagree with their families on the subject of LGBTQ people. He concludes his article by admitting, "I have been on a constant campaign of trying to change people's minds about us." Another gay activist in Canada has written an essay critical of the homosexual movement. She says, "There is something dark and vaguely cultish about this particular brand of politics. I've thought a lot about what exactly that is. I've pinned down 4 core features that make it so disturbing: dogmatism, groupthink, a crusader mentality, and anti-intellectualism. If someone disagrees with the prevailing homosexual mindset, they're not just wrong, but they're seen as awful people. They also divide the world into an in-group and an out-group. Disagree on just one item, and you become a heretic. Groupthink becomes the modus operandi. And there's a crusader mentality in which an extreme self-righteousness based on the conviction that they're doing the secular equivalent of God's work." These candid comments help explain why Christian florists and bakers and photographers are being persecuted by homosexual activists. Most of us have a live and let live philosophy of life. Homosexual activists apparently do not. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Chuck Bentley, and he is the CEO of Crown Financial. And we thought we might also spend a little bit of time, Chuck, talking about the federal debt. This is very well written, and I hope to borrow some of these quotes and use them later on, perhaps when we get closer to the 4th of July, because when you think about this, we have the founder's fear of federal debt. And I might point out that this was originally published in the Washington Times, but you reprinted it in Crown. We have it on our website. And I think it illustrates how things have changed. The founders were very afraid, and I was amazed at the number of quotes that you had from founders who were so concerned that debt could be the destruction of the nation. And today, it's hard to find more than maybe a handful of members of Congress, or even the current occupant in the Oval Office, who thinks that the federal debt is any big problem.
Well, in my article, I quoted President Obama, who said, "We do not have an immediate crisis in terms of our debt." Now, I don't know if that gives you any comfort at all, Kirby, but to say it's not immediate is just kicking the can down the road. And I think that's what all of the administrations have done over the past 2 or 3 decades. And I'm not talking about simply a a Democratic problem. This is a problem on both sides of the aisle because everybody keeps pushing it off, and we can't even agree to balance the budget to stop overspending in one single year right now. There's no agreement on that point. So we've reached this point where not only do we not fear debt, we've become dependent upon it. And I just returned from Zimbabwe.
Oh,
and
yes.
Kirby, you don't have to be there long to figure out that you cannot borrow your way to prosperity. It's impossible because Zimbabwe printed money. Did you know at one point in their economic history, their Zim dollar was on par with the British pound, not the American dollar. It was on par with the British pound, meaning it had about a 15 to 20% greater value than a U.S. dollar. It was greater than the dollar, and it's the fastest destruction of an economy in history because of a number of serious problems, but primarily they tried to borrow their way out of their economic crises, and they collapsed the currency. One of my friends there said, if a person gave you a burlap bag full of money, the bag was worth more than the contents. The bag itself was worth more. And, they had, at one point, people were writing checks for $1 quadrillion. I think that's 20 zeros behind it. And, of course, those checks became worthless as well. So debt's a problem for all of us. Look what's happening in Europe, where they've got the economic, the European Union, which is economic enslavement of all of the people who now are having to try to bail out Greece once again. And it's a problem right now. People don't want to have to pay other people's debts. So what's happening to the American people is our government spending out of control. They're enslaving the population to debts that we're obligated to pay or suffer the consequences if we don't pay them, and no one's holding them accountable. One of the quotes in my article is from John Adams, who I have the utmost respect for as a man of God, as a man of great conviction who sacrificed so much to build this country. And he said it's very simple. 2 ways to enslave a nation. One is by the sword and the other is by debt. And I think we've got to wake up to this and to say, at a minimum, can we at least stop spending more money than we take in? And when we've talked about this in the past, Kirby, I've mentioned there's one big pushback to this argument. And people say that we're fear-mongering because of this alarm or concern over the federal debt. And we don't need to worry about it because the federal government has so many assets. We're worth trillions and trillions of dollars. We have all these national assets. And in fact, Donald Trump is one of those people who say, you're just not doing the math. Debt is such a small percentage of our assets, it's no big deal. Well, first of all, who wants to sell the Statue of Liberty and all of our national parks?
Right.
Who wants to try to sell the highway systems? Part of the assets of this country, nobody wants to have to sell those. I mean, the Greeks aren't willing to sell their islands, to pay off their debt.
That's right.
So the assets aren't really liquid. They're not things that you can sell in order to pay off these debts. And the biggest problem with debt is that it requires immediate cash flow. When there's somebody that needs paid, they want paid now. I played a game with my boys by changing the rules of Monopoly, where you didn't have to limit what you could have by what was you could borrow from the bank or be issued from the bank. You could actually create debt between yourself and all the other players. And that game went on and on and on and on. And in fact, it got outrageous how much money those properties were becoming worth because you just make up numbers in your head.
Yes.
And negotiate with these crazy numbers. And I would write down that I owed him, and then he would write down that I had to pay him. And so we went around. And finally, we didn't, the cash was irrelevant. It was meaningless. It was worthless. And one of the boys in the game said, well, I want you to pay me in cash. I don't want a note. I don't want to borrow any more money. I want you to pay me in cash. And, of course, nobody could. The game was over. And so it's like a game of musical chairs, this crazy federal debt game we're playing. And I think it's propped up the market. I still believe that since 2009, we're on what's many economists call a sugar high, where we've had the slow drip of printing money and borrowing money in order to prop up the economy. And once the musical chair stops, I think we're going to be in real trouble. And that musical chair, that music may stop when interest rates start to rise. And there's concern about that right now, Kirby.
That is certainly a great concern, and that's one of the reasons why I encourage people to consider not only the federal debt, but their own personal one. And, Chuck, you've written on this in my most recent book, Make the Most of Your Money in Tough Times. I begin to document the levels of federal indebtedness, but then I go on to say, now, don't point your finger, because the amount of consumer debt is at an all-time high as well. Doesn't Proverbs have something to say about what it means to be in debt?
Well, absolutely, Kirby, and I'm so in alignment with you on your book and what you've written about it. Proverbs says that just as the rich rule over the poor, so the borrower is a servant to the lender. And essentially, I think the reason the Lord reminded us not to be indebted, not to get ourselves in a position where we would be enslaved, is because we're to live with only one master. And I know you're going to talk about this in your second hour today, Kirby, but what you see happening in Indiana is a form of economic persecution. The people who don't share our values are saying, if you won't conform to our values, we're going to punish you economically. Well, it'd be, if you're in a position where you don't have debt, when you can say, I'm going to stand up for my beliefs and not be afraid of those who might try to lord it over me or to be my master because of my economic dependency, then you can truly serve the master who wants us to stand up for truth. And so debt can inhibit us from really being bold and courageous, as you are, and willing to speak the truth.
Just incredible. When you were talking, too, about Zimbabwe, the last time David Jeremiah was in the studio, he had written a book on economic issues. And, of course, you write on that, and I write on it occasionally, but this was kind of new for him. So I gave everybody, including him and everybody that was traveling with him, I think at that time it was a $50 trillion Zimbabwe note. And he looked at it like, I said, no, that really was real, and now I've got some 100 trillion Zimbabwe notes. And if you just want to understand what happens when you debase your currency, at one time, as you said, the Zimbabwe dollar was worth more than the U.S. dollar. Now the paper is worth more than the ink that is printed on it. And that's kind of a sad commentary on where we are. So let's take a break. I know many of you would like to ask some questions already. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to stay out of poverty and how to address poverty. That's certainly a conversation we've had with Chuck in previous programs, but I wanted to give you a couple action items. First of all, I really would encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, and first of all, find some of these articles. One about how to really live in these end times. Number two, what about this issue of the federal debt? And I think you're going to find some really great quotes. We've, of course, given you one from John Adams, but there's some from Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and many others that I would encourage you to maybe cut and paste or maybe put that whole article on your maybe Facebook page or blog, or maybe you have a place that you could put it in an email to someone and start that conversation about financial issues. But also, as you go to the website, we have our Truth Team 360, and last week, of course, we talked a little bit about that and mentioned it with Chuck. We'll get more into that in just a few minutes, but it's our way of encouraging you to join with us financially, and if you can do so, certainly you can click on that button, and as you do so, you'll find there are all sorts of resources. Joining the team, of course, first of all, gives you a chance to support this ministry, but we also give you an opportunity to select a welcome gift that we would like to send to you, and as we've said before, for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you can be part of that team, and we're looking for other members in that regard. But let me also open up the phones. I suspect you have some comments or questions about what we've talked about. 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about end times. We talked about federal debt. When we come back, we're going to talk about poverty. What does the Bible say about that, and how can we address it? We'll be right back.
It is such a small thing, but it can make someone's day. It's very easy to do, but too often we fail anyway. The Bible says not doing it is a sin, at least in relation to God, and it is something all of us at Point of View are feeling this week, the need to say thank you. Last week was our big push for Truth Team 360. This week we're Thanks Team 360. So very grateful for you who stepped up and made a commitment to support the work of Point of View. When someone does something right, we need to thank them, and By the way, maybe you could send a quick note of thanks to Governor Mike Pence of Indiana. He did the right thing, but he's paying a heavy price for it, and I'm sure he could use some appreciation. But again, on behalf of Kirby Anderson and Penna Dexter, for last week's special friend Brad Fisk, a great big thank you. You stepped up, which allows us to continue stepping up and applying truth to the issues of our time. And one more thing, you gave. Don't forget to pray. That is our greatest need as we fulfill our mission. One more time, thank you for joining Truth Team 360. Thank you for your support of Point of View.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Chuck Bentley, CEO of Crown Financial. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Ken in Alabama first. Ken, what would you like to share with our audience today?
Thank you, Kirby. So many people don't understand or fathom the enormity of our debt. Dr. Chuck Missler one time put it in perspective. He said, suppose I said to you, hey, I need to borrow $20. Can I borrow $20 from you? So you get your wallet out. As you hand the $20 to him, you ask, well, when do you think you could pay me back? And you say, well, I could probably pay you back in about 1,000,000 seconds from now. So you get your pocket calculator out and you divide that out and you find out, well, that's about 4 days from now. But then you say, 4 days. And then you say, oh, I'm sorry, did I say million? I meant to say billion with a B. Well, you get your pocket calculator out and you divide it again and you find out, well, that's 32 years from now. And you say, well, wait a minute, I can't wait that long. But then you say, oh, I'm sorry, did I say billion? I meant to say trillion with a T. And you divide that out and you find out that's 32,000 years from now. So it gives you just some idea of the enormity of our debt. In fact, I think Dr. Missler said that it's his belief that it's probably gone too far, that we will never be able to pay it back other than hyperinflation or else a default. And I appreciate you and your guest comment on that, and I was hang up and listen.
One of the things, Chuck, that we've heard said before is, $1 million here and $1 million there, it adds up to real money. But how about $1 billion here and $1 billion here, it adds up to real money? How about $1 trillion here and $1 trillion here, it adds up to more than we can possibly fathom? What's your thoughts?
Well, my first observation is Ken is very fluent in his illustration. I was impressed that he could actually remember that story so well with all of the calculations. He's right. The federal debt has reached numbers that we used to only use in high school astronomy classes where we were trying to figure out how far it was to one of the planets. And he's also right that it's probably to the point of no return, meaning we really will never be in a position where we paid off the federal debt. I would say one of the factors you did not mention, Ken, is that besides printing money and borrowing money, you omitted the fact that there will be an increase in taxes.
Yeah.
Every time debt increases, the tax burden of the American citizen increases. And going back to Zimbabwe, where they had a currency collapse, they now converted their currency to the U.S. dollar. But let me explain what their current tax rate is.
Wow.
If you make between $0 and $300, you're tax exempt. You don't pay any federal income tax in Zimbabwe. But you start at $300 a month. So if you earn $300 a month, you start at their tax rate. If you get up to $1,500 a month, you're at their maximum tax rate at 57%. And they have a sales tax in the nation of 17%. So essentially, you're paying over 60% in taxes if you earn $1,500 a month. And that's because they have such an enormous deficit. They've had such an enormous problem of digging out of the hole that they created. So don't think that the taxpayer is going to get out of it. Even if we default, the tax burden could still be substantial. That's why it's so dangerous and such a concern. Our founder said that it leads to slavery, which in fact it becomes a de facto method of enslaving a population. So we should really be vigilant at starting at the local level, at the state level, and going all the way up to the national level to say, live within your means. If you have a budget, live within it. And I don't know what part of Alabama Ken was calling from, but if you study what happened in Birmingham with the city borrowed money to build a sewer system, and it essentially caused the city government to default on this massive debt.
Amazing.
Because they couldn't pay it back, even for a city project like as simple as a sewer system.
You're talking about taxes, and there's a book coming out, and I've just read about it, and I've ordered it, but it hasn't come yet, but I've heard about it through George Will, entitled Popular Economics, and the subtitle is What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics. So I suspect you will be doing commentaries on it, I'll be doing commentaries, but you might say, what does Rolling Stones have to do with it? Well, the tax rate was so high in the UK that they finally moved to France. Now, some of the people that are listening to this broadcast, Chuck, are in states where the tax rate is relatively low, at least in terms of the state tax. And we've watched over the years how people have moved out of California, and they've moved maybe in many cases from North Dakota to South Dakota. They've moved to Washington where they don't have a state income tax, moved to Florida, whatever. But as you point out, if this is a problem at the federal level, you can't moving from one state to another doesn't help you. And if everybody has a high taxation rate, you can't quite do what the Rolling Stones did years ago, because the tax rate here, if it's going up and the tax rate is high in Europe, there's kind of nowhere to go without having a confiscatory taxes taken out of your income.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, we're entering a period of time in our history where there are no places where you can actually escape it. What you find, Kirby, you're actually living in a state that's had the benefit of a robust economy, and many people have left states where taxation was ever increasing, such as New York, and they're now trying to move where there's a less of a tax burden. But the day will come when just the federal taxation alone will be so great that none of us will be able to escape that burden.
Let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, talk about poverty. The last time we had you on the program, you've talked about that, and you have traveled the world, so we're not just talking about poverty in America, but for the moment, let's focus there. But certainly, as we see poverty around the world, it's significant. And one of the articles, again, that I want to commend to our listeners, God's Principles Help Us to Thrive, and you use kind of the 3 golden rules that our friend Robert Rector, who's been on the program with us many times before, at the Heritage Foundation, points out. If you follow biblical principles, it's not a 100% guarantee that you will thrive, but if you violate God's principles, there's almost a 100% guarantee that you will not, and that you will face some kind of failure. So what are some of those guiding principles that maybe some of the young people listening right now need to understand and begin to apply to their lives?
I think the brilliance of Robert Rector's recommendation, or really his research, is that he made it so simple. Here they are, Kirby. Graduate from high school, marry before having children, and get a job. If you will do those 3 simple things, your probability of experiencing poverty in America plunges. It is not a guaranteed formula, but the probability dramatically is reduced. And I think those all line up with God's principles. You know, the Bible talks about in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. God Word wants us to be knowledgeable people, to be educated, to be continually learning and growing. That doesn't just mean a formal education, but we should be people who are open to new ideas and learning from every possible source that we can. But even at a high school level, if you graduate from high school, you've demonstrated that you can complete your coursework, you didn't drop out, you didn't quit, and you're able to learn. And secondly, to get married. Most people think that marriage actually is negative for their financial well-being. The Bible encourages marriage, as you know, and the Bible says that God designed marriage for our own benefit. And I've looked at all the statistics, Kirby. Did you know that our net worth increases dramatically after we marry versus if we remain single or live with somebody? So marriage is good for our net worth. Having children actually improves our income and net worth, but that should be done inside the confines of marriage. If you have children before marrying, then it is an indication that you're on the road to poverty. And then finally, to get a job. And certainly the Bible says that we're to be workers and productive. That's the dominion principle, where God put us on the earth to have dominion over it, to improve it, and to be productive with our hands, and to multiply the resources that God put here on earth. So those are very simple principles, but that's how we thrive. If we'll follow those, then we don't have to fear poverty.
You know, one of the other articles, and I'll go into a break, but I thought I'd mention it just before we take our break, that I used a number of years ago, comes from William Galston, and he was actually an advisor to President Clinton. He had 3 different ones, but they're very similar, and that is, he said, to avoid poverty, graduate from high school. Number 2, wait until age 20 to have children. Number 3, wait until getting married to have children. If you use his 3, statistically, you only have an 8% chance of poverty. That is, only 8% of the people who follow those 3 things are poor. However, if a young person breaks just one of those rules, they have a 79% chance of ending up below the poverty line. And, of course, when you think about some of that 8% might be those who have just moved here, unskilled immigrants, those who are working their way up the ladder, you can begin to see how what we might call the golden rules to avoid poverty are very, very important. So that article is on the website. We'll come back and let's open up the phones, give you a chance to join our conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. Chuck Bentley with us with Crown Financial. We'll be back with him and you right after this.
Point of View, Truth Team 360, Joseph Farah.
Well, I think Point of View is one of the first radio programs to really give us alternative news, if you will, to ferret out those stories that the so-called mainstream media would never bring to people. That is what has always made your program fascinating. It's what has always delivered the audience to you. For people who are really hungry for the real story, for real information, there is no parallel to Point of View.
Back once again with Chuck Bentley, and one of the things we've been encouraging you to do is to join with us, Truth Team 360. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But Chuck, that's a good question for you, because a lot of individuals say, I only have this limited number of resources. I feel that God has called me to support my church, and I certainly believe that's your first priority. But how do we assess our priorities? I'm even thinking of this piece that you wrote real recently about the whole new way to think about poverty. I'm kind of humbled when I read your piece about coming back from a conference in Zimbabwe and finding people that have a whole lot less in their pockets than most of us do, and see how they worship the Lord and how, in some respects, they're depending upon the Lord for their daily bread. I just thank the Lord for my daily bread, but I can remember a time when it was really tight financially for us, especially when I was in graduate school, and we really were praying for our daily bread. And I think that is a difference, isn't it?
I think, Kirby, when we look at the people of Zimbabwe and we think they're the worst-case scenario in terms of what most Americans fear. Just think with me for just a second. What do we fear the most? We fear being governed by a dictator. None of us are, or at least I would say most of the population, I hope, would fear that would be something that would be undesirable. We fear an economic collapse. We fear the loss of jobs. We fear the destruction of all of our life savings because of hyperinflation and national debt. Well, every bit of all of that has happened. And there's 14 million people there, and I have served there and been there many times now. And these are people who are enjoying their life in spite of all of these economic hardships, in spite of the setbacks. Now, I'm not trying to say that they're better off because of it. They're not. They've suffered, and they've been hurt, they've been broken people, but their faith in God has brought them through this, and they're doing okay. They're managing, and they have joy. Their praise is infectious when we worship together, and I was just struck by the fact that if they've gone through everything that we fear, why are we gripped by fear? Why can't we be more joyful? Because we still have so very much. We still have freedom, and we still have an ability to proclaim the truth and to speak our opinions like you do boldly on point of view. All of those things are should be cherished. When I think about giving, Kirby, and what I would say to encourage people to give to this program specifically is, first of all, who are you honoring first in your life? The Bible says to honor God with the first fruits of our wealth. So we should honor God. It's a way to say, Lord, you are my priority, and your message is my priority, and your kingdom is my priority, and everything that I have came from you, and I'm only giving back to you what you've already given me. It reminds me of the story of the dad who bought his son, a McDonald's burger and some fries, and he reached over to get a fry, and the little boy said, no, these are mine. And the dad was looking at him like, wait a minute. I provided the whole thing for you. I can't even have a French fry.
Yeah.
And we act that way towards God. So first, honor God with your wealth because he's provided all. And then secondly, determine what kind of steward do you want to be. Do you want to be a steward with a 30, 60, 100-fold return on investment? And I've been in radio a long time. You've been doing this so long, Kirby. You've been so faithful. And I would say to people who are really serious about having a mutual fund of investments in the kingdom, point of view is a great part of their portfolio. You're standing for truth. You're shedding light on the issues that we're not going to hear in mainstream media. You're defending it from a biblical perspective. You're absolutely authentic in what you believe. You're trustworthy. I can't imagine why anybody wouldn't want to say, I want to be a Truth Team 360 partner and invest in the organization and to help you to continue to do what you do. There's a burden to do in ministry, and the burden for most guys in ministry is that they have to have the resources to make it happen. And they want to do that in an effective way to let their needs be known, but not to be excessive about that and not to be greedy in any way, but to make those needs known. And so I come beside you to help you with that, Kirby. I'm reminded of what Charles Spurgeon said when he had to raise some money for so many of the ministries and causes that he started there in London. He stood before a group one day and he said, brothers, the Lord has provided all of my needs, and I stand before you grateful for what God has provided and supplied for me. but I'm also greedy for the kingdom of God. I love that because, the world's greedy for every penny that we have. The world will try to take every penny that the Christian has available to them and have it consumed on something else, something new, something shiny, something bigger, better, faster. And yet, when in the final analysis, God is going to ask us, did you make my kingdom a priority? Were you faithful? He's not going to ask, were you successful with money? He's going to say, were you faithful with money? And faithfulness is a relational term. Were you faithful in our relationship to advance the kingdom of God, to honor me with the resources I've entrusted to you? And to me, that's a guaranteed investment. That's a sure bet, Kirby. $30 a month to be a Truth Team 360 partner. I would say to all your listeners, come and join. And I know you mentioned it last week, Kirby, and so I'm not here to beat the drum over and over and over, but I would say if there was anybody listening that was on the fence, come and join today. Support where you're being fed. Support those who are getting the work done that you can trust, that are beacons of hope, beacons of integrity, and folks that are just making it happen, and help relieve that burden. I know I can speak for you, Kirby, that it's a burden that every ministry leader has to bear, that we need the resources, and we look to God and trust God to move on the hearts of his people. The people are the economic engine of the kingdom. So I would trust that people would, if they've been wavering or they were thinking, maybe it's time to do that, well, go ahead and do it today. Today's April the 1st. You can benchmark that and start today and sign up and remain faithful to Point of View.
Well, appreciate the kind comments. And let me just mention, those of you on the line, will get to your calls in the second hour, but let me also return the favor and say we do have a link to Crown Financial Ministries, and it's crown.org. And there you're going to find various financial tools that will help you. Maybe if you're kind of figuring out where you need to be in your career, if you want to know a little bit more about business by the book. And of course, we certainly want to benefit from all the great things that come from your blog post as well as your broadcast, My Money Life. I certainly want to encourage people to go there. And Chuck, always great to have you on the program, and thank you for partnering with us today, and thank you for those kind words. Well, I appreciate you, Kirby. I sincerely do. I'm so grateful for what you're doing. I know it takes courage and it takes perseverance. It's not an easy road to be in ministry, especially in today's culture. It's starting to cost the Christian. I read a New York Times article that recently that said, evangelical Christians are not very highly thought of anymore in our culture. Saw that. And so we've got a battle to fight, and we're going to fight it with truth and love and grace. And you're one of the great fighters out there. So thank you, Kirby. It's always my honor. Well, great to have you on the program. We need to take a break. When we come back, let's, if we can, get into a few issues. A few of you have some comments about what we can do about our government and our financial debt. Of course, if you also want to join us as we talk about what's happening in Indiana and many other topics I'm going to put on the table, all that coming up right after these important messages.
Now, let me see if I can get this straight. Apple President Tim Cook, Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy, and countless others are calling for a boycott of Indiana, refusing to do business with the state, and that's good. But when a small business owner, because of a commitment to religious conviction, freedoms protected under the Constitution, chooses not to do business for a so-called gay wedding, that's something that should be prosecuted. Can anyone explain this to me? Some say Indiana Governor Mike Pence is caving in to pressure. Others, like Gary Bowers, say he's not. I don't know. What I do know is we need to pray for America. Would you agree? Join our Pray for America movement today by clicking into pointofview.net/pray. Sign up. We'll send you our free Pray for America booklet and prayer updates on things to pray for. America is in turmoil. God's people need to pray. Stand with us on our knees. Pray for Mike Pence. Pray for America. Pointofview.net/pray. Pointofview.net/pray.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us in the first hour Chuck Bentley, and I wanted to take at least one phone call left over from that first hour. So let's go to Georgia first. And John, thank you for joining us today. I think you wanted to address this issue of the federal debt. Go for it.
Yes, sir. I enjoyed your talk there. That was quite enlightening. I haven't heard anybody speak like that in quite a while. My question is, would it be possible to bring a action in law against the Congress of the United States based on the Constitution? Because we give them the money. Aren't they responsible to handle it in a reasonable manner?
Yeah, I think there could be some recourse. I'm not sure a lawsuit works, simply because, as we've talked about before with Kelly Shackelford, governmental agencies are immune from prosecution. I think that is a wrong philosophy, but I understand why it's implemented, because every time a lawmaker passes a bill, he or she then could be sued by somebody who might be adversely affected by it and would tie up the court. So I get that. But at the same time, we should have ways to hold people accountable. Yeah, I know the typical answer is, yeah, we hold them accountable at the ballot box. No, we don't. I mean, we unfortunately go along with that. Everybody would like the budget balanced, but they don't want the budget balanced on their pet projects. So part of the problem, John, is that even though we as Americans say we would like to have a balanced budget, the moment we move in that direction, you begin to hear some cries and some complaints. And so that's, I think, the difficulty. We have to recognize that Congress, in some respects, is doing what we want them to do. We really want them to spend money on our stuff, but we have less interest in them spending money on other people's stuff. And we've got to have a broader vision for that. And that's one of the reasons we talked about that today with Chuck Bentley. That's one of the reasons I've written a book on the subject. And that's why we'll probably continue talking about it here on Point of View. But there should be some way to hold them accountable other than just the ballot box, because we just seem to continually elect at least a majority of members of Congress who don't seem concerned about a federal debt. And as we talked about last week with Michael Ferris, we aren't going to bail ourselves out of it easily. His suggestion was maybe we could bail ourselves out by selling off some of the mineral rights in the country, but you can only do that once. And if we don't fix the problem, that's why he was suggesting an Article 5 constitutional convention. But if you don't agree with that, then amendments or something to prevent this from ever happening again. And I'm not optimistic, but I'm still going to try to do my best to get enough people concerned about this so that we don't burden our children and grandchildren with this enormous amount of federal debt that we've left to them. John, appreciate your phone call, and let's move on to our other topics, and there are many. Let me put on the table for just a few minutes, though, the issue of what is happening in Indiana. And some of us around the table having a little bit of fun, because there's a piece I want to read in just a minute from the American Enterprise Institute saying that Tim Cook, you might say, who's he? Well, he's the CEO of Apple. It's entitled, "Tim Cook Needs to Do Some Homework." But we found out just a while ago that the governor of Connecticut needs to do his homework, too. Now, he appeared on Morning Joe today, and he is the governor of Connecticut, Daniel Malloy, and he was very critical of what the governor of Indiana, Mike Pence, was doing. He says the governor's not a stupid man. He's just done stupid things, and signing this law and, quite frankly, promoting this law, knowing exactly what it was going to do, was an incredibly stupid thing for him to do. So that's what the governor of Connecticut said about a law which is called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA. I can look at my little chart here. I'll hold it up for anybody that wants to be watching online. And if you look at that little chart there, you will notice something very interesting. Connecticut has the same law. As a matter of fact, it's slightly more restrictive, if you want to be blunt about it, than the one that was just signed in Indiana. Now, I wish we had some newsbusters out there, and maybe they will do this, that will actually sort of, if you will, pants this man on national television to point out, but I don't think anybody caught him the day, in which he is criticizing the law that his own state has, which I think illustrates the point we've made on this program before. If you think sometimes that the people that you elect to office are smarter than you are, maybe sometimes they are. I will be the first to admit that oftentimes when you're around somebody like a Newt Gingrich or somebody like a Ted Cruz, yep, pretty much smartest man in the room. Okay. But most of the time, it's not the case. And in this particular case, you have the governor of Connecticut criticizing the governor of Indiana for signing a law which is essentially the same law that is the law of the land in Connecticut. It's also, by the way, for our friends next door, it's also the law of the land in Rhode Island and many of the various states up there, Pennsylvania and others. A lot of the states that have signed it tend to be more in the Midwest and the South, but not exclusively at all. And as you are beginning to see, this is just a good example of maybe needing to do your homework. With that as background, let me read real quickly what Ramesh Ponnuru says. Tim Cook needs to do some homework. He says, Tim Cook, the chief executive officer of Apple, is spreading misinformation about a new religious freedom law in Indiana. He says that law and similar ones, he writes in the Washington Post, quote, say individuals can cite their personal religious beliefs to refuse service to a customer or resist a state non-discrimination law, quote. That's at least the argument that is being made by Tim Cook. Well, he goes on to claim that they are, quote, rationalizing injustice by pretending to defend something many of us hold dear. They go against the very principles our nation was founded on, and they have the potential to undo decades of progress towards greater equality, unquote. Customers or employers is what opponents of the law are essentially concerned about, but it's a strange argument to make in the context of Indiana, which lacks any state non-discrimination law on sexual orientation for people to resist. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is legal almost everywhere in the state and was before the religious freedom law was passed. He says Cook may not be aware of this point, or others may cut against his argument because reporting on this controversy, Ramesh Ponnuru says, has been abysmal. He says Tim Cook may also be unaware that the wave of legislation that he fears has largely already happened. A very similar religious freedom law has been on the books for 22 years, and that law itself codified the Supreme Court doctrine that has been in place for most of the previous few decades. 19 states besides Indiana have similar laws. The laws don't seem to be abetting a rising tide of discrimination based on sexual orientation or based on anything else. He finally says what these religious freedom laws says is that government can require people to violate their religious beliefs only when it is pursuing a compelling interest, and must do so in the least intrusive manner possible. Thus, the Supreme Court ruled recently under a federal religious freedom law that a Muslim prisoner doesn't have to shave his beard. These sort of accommodations have long been in place in American law and have typically been advanced to protect Muslims, Hindus, adherents of traditional native religions, and other minorities. Goes on and makes some other points, but we need to go to a break. And when we come back, I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. You see this unfold over the last couple of days, first in Indiana. Now it's going to happen in perhaps Arkansas. What are your thoughts about media coverage and the issue of so-called discrimination? 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
You know, perhaps homosexual activists believe that they have been victorious and can now be more honest about their agenda. In the past, many would deny there's a gay agenda. Now they're talking about it openly. At least they're talking about it in Canada. Bear Bergman is a Canadian activist who recently said he was tired of hiding his true agenda. He said, "I am here to tell you, all the time I said I wasn't indoctrinating anyone with my beliefs about gay and lesbian and bi and trans and queer people, that was a lie." As the head of a Toronto publishing company, he was taught how to use soft language when talking about homosexuality. He was not to betray his real goal, which was to recruit kids into the lifestyle. He wanted those kids to actually disagree with their families on the subject of LGBTQ people. He concludes his article by admitting, "I have been on a constant campaign of trying to change people's minds about us." Another gay activist in Canada has written an essay critical of the homosexual movement. She says, "There is something dark and vaguely cultish about this particular brand of politics. I've thought a lot about what exactly that is. I've pinned down 4 core features that make it so disturbing: dogmatism, groupthink, a crusader mentality, and anti-intellectualism. If someone disagrees with the prevailing homosexual mindset, they're not just wrong, but they're seen as awful people. They also divide the world into an in-group and an out-group. Disagree on just one item, and you become a heretic. Groupthink becomes the modus operandi. And there's a crusader mentality in which an extreme self-righteousness based on the conviction that they're doing the secular equivalent of God's work." These candid comments help explain why Christian florists and bakers and photographers are being persecuted by homosexual activists. Most of us have a live and let live philosophy of life. Homosexual activists apparently do not. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you can join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Going to stay on this issue of religious liberty a little bit longer. Then I want to get to some other issues in the news that you need to know about. A lot of issues related to Hillary Clinton's emails, and we're going to follow that. A couple of other topics I want to put on the table a little bit later. We'll even talk about the very first attempt to assassinate Martin Luther King Jr. and what that could mean and could have meant to the whole civil rights movement. So we'll talk about that just in terms of the historical context. Every once in a while we like to mention some things that happened in the past that we need to know about. But one of the questions I certainly want to put on the table, and you can either respond to this by calling in or simply going to our Facebook page and responding. We'd love to know from you as a listener how we can maybe encourage you or give you more action items. The action item we have at the moment is a very simple one, and the action item is for you to send a note of appreciation to Governor Mike Pence in Indiana. We also believe that Asa Hutchinson perhaps will sign the same bill in Arkansas. If that's the case, we certainly want to give you that opportunity. But I also know that sometimes you would like to be able to maybe set the record straight. At the moment, I'm reading from a piece by Ramesh Ponnuru, and that was something I thought about. Would you want to perhaps have us provide a way where you could express your opinion to the CEO of Apple, or maybe even one that I think is even more appropriate? I mentioned yesterday that Angie's List has said that they are simply opposed to what is happening in Indiana right now, and they've decided that they might pull out of Indiana, or they might seriously reconsider whether or not they would be involved in Indiana. Is that something that maybe you would want to have as an action item? Of course, you're free to do it individually, but sometimes people say, well, I don't know where the email is. I don't know who to contact, and we can do the background research and help you out on that. We've had someone call in just recently and said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could set up some kind of fund to help those who have been hurt by this? We have, of course, Aaron and Melissa Klein that have been fined $150,000, although I do think Alliance Defending Freedom will get them out from under it, but they certainly have lost their business. We can talk about the florist, Baronelle Stutzman in Washington, that has lost her floral business, but also might be driven into bankruptcy. And we can point you to those, possibilities. But I'd love to hear from you. And you don't have to necessarily come online. I know some of you would never pick up a phone and call me, but maybe you can either send us an email, hit our contact point, or else go to our Facebook page and suggest some of that, because we would certainly want to encourage you to tell us what you're looking for, because we want to not only educate you, but we really want to empower you to make a difference. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in meetings where an email or a letter was all that was necessary, sometimes to change a policy. I remember years ago in the Dallas Morning News, sometimes if they get 2 or 3 letters on an issue, sometimes the whole editorial department would begin to rally and say, well, what can we do to address this issue? I've had members of legislatures, state legislatures, even sometimes members of Congress, especially if a state legislator gets 2 or 3 letters. I mean, they are paying attention really quickly, and corporate entities the same. So I think we want to do what we can to really give you some opportunities to make a difference. And so I'd love to hear from some of you when you have time to do that. Let me take a few more phone calls here, and we will certainly give you a chance to join the conversation today. In California, KYCC, Garla, thank you for calling today.
Thank you, Kirby, very much for taking my call, because I have wondered this, but could you please tell me when America first started going into national debt? I really don't understand it. We are the greatest, most powerful country, and I don't understand. Did we vote on it?
We did not.
How did America go into debt?
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. We were in debt after the Revolutionary War, and so the various members of Congress and other philanthropists paid off the debt. And we went through a period of time where we had minimal government debt. Then we really were in significant debt after the Civil War, which is understandable because of the incredible devastation that took place. But again, there was a time of trying to pay that off. But once you came to essentially the 20th century, there is a man, and again, this is summarizing from my book, so I'm going to give you the kind of the Cliff Notes version because it's a little more detailed. But there was a man by the name of John Maynard Keynes who argued that, you don't really have to worry about debt. After all, we only owe it to ourselves. And so debt could be used to really help get us out of an economic downturn. And so those ideas were especially adopted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression. And then, of course, after World War II, we had some debt as well. But again, all of this debt, when compared to the gross domestic product, was relatively low. But it was significant. First, all the government spending programs during, the public works programs during the Great Depression. And then, of course, all the spending of World War II. But then after World War II, we had the massive expansion of the economy. Basically, the median family income doubled during the time in which baby boomers came into the world. So the parents of baby boomers really grew up in an expanding pie, so did the government. That was good until you got to, and now this is another president, President Lyndon Johnson, who was trying to develop all of these domestic programs. At the same time, he was fighting Vietnam War. And so he began to figure out ways in which he could spend, because it used to be that you had to decide, I'm going to spend it on guns or butter, is the famous phrase. And he decided he wanted to spend it on both guns and butter. And there are all sorts of other reasons for that, but eventually we went off the gold standard. That was done by Richard Nixon. But anyway, to give you kind of a current understanding, at the time in which Ronald Reagan came into power, we still, even at that time, did not have a debt that was $1 trillion. By the time, it was about $1 trillion in round numbers. By the time Ronald Reagan left, it was pretty close to $2 trillion, which still isn't good, but given the ratio between $2 trillion and the gross domestic product at the time, not too bad and possibly manageable. But from that point on, under George Herbert Walker Bush, under Bill Clinton, under George W. Bush, and especially perhaps the fastest increase in the federal debt under Barack Obama, we have now, most people use the $18 trillion. So you can see the difference between $1 trillion when Ronald Reagan was the president, came in as a president, or even $2 trillion almost when he left, and $18 trillion. So you can see that once we got kind of comfortable with this idea of debt, nobody ever changed the direction. We also sometimes hear that under Bill Clinton, we had balanced budgets. That's not quite true, but I'll give credit where credit was due. When you had Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House in a Republican House, and you had a Democrat president, Bill Clinton, you had something that looked on paper like a balanced budget, but they were still stealing money, if you will, out of Social Security Trust Fund. But the closest we've had to anything looking like a balanced budget was when you had a Democratic president and a Republican House and Senate. And, of course, that's kind of what we have now, but nobody seems to be that concerned about it. So back to Garla's question, did we vote on it? Well, not directly, but indirectly we sure did. We voted on our members of Congress who decided that they would just keep spending, and we have had dramatically increased federal deficits. The deficit is the difference in 1 year between how much you bring in and how much you spend. The debt is the accumulated debt from George Washington to Barack Obama. Put another way, you almost have as much debt that has been run up under Barack Obama as you had debt that was run up from George Washington to George W. Bush. That tells you quite a bit about how today, when you have people making comments about we're going to try to balance the budget, how far off we actually are. Maybe gave you a longer answer than you wanted, but that's a quick look at our history and a recognition that we have now moved from being, back when Ronald Reagan was president, the largest creditor nation of the world. Now, under President Barack Obama, we are the largest debtor nation in the world. Let's take a break. We'll come back. I think we've got some updates here on what's happening in Arkansas, but also I wanted to focus on a few other issues that we can talk about. And one of the other action items we wanted to give to you today, in addition to supporting the decision by Governor Mike Pence to sign that Religious Freedom Restoration Act, is an encouragement maybe to leave a note on our Facebook page or to hit our contact information. Tell us what you'd like, because I think another obvious step is to let, Apple Computers and Angie's List and others know you kind of disagree with them. And I'm sure they'd love to hear from consumers. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more and your phone calls right after this.
If you were with us last week, you know we had a major focus on Truth Team 360, our band of monthly contributors all across this nation, devoted to freedom, religious freedom, and civil freedom. We were very moved by each of you who called or visited our website, and I'm sure that some wrote, and perhaps they're still on the way here, regardless of how you joined or how much you sacrificed. Please know how grateful we are for your partnership. Our desire is to focus on the issues impacting our families, our churches, our communities, and our future together. The less we have to think about paying expenses means more time to find just the right guest to equip you to address the pressing needs of the day. So our big message is thank you. And if you missed out, yes, you can still join the team. Visit pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. By phone, 1-800-347-5151, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour open line if you'd like to join us. We've talked about many issues today, and you are welcome to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Next caller wants to turn our attention from Indiana to Arkansas. Might just mention that the governor there in Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, says that he is not planning to sign the bill unless state lawmakers make a few changes. Now, that may just be an attempt to find some legitimate places where clarification is necessary. That might just be an attempt to prevent any kind of firestorm from breaking out. But you can understand that if you're kind of looking right now at a map, which I'm looking at, of the various states that have an existing Religious Freedom Restoration Act, you can go from Virginia to the east all the way to Arizona to the west and find just a solid red of various states that have passed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and one state that sticks out at the moment is Arkansas. I might also mention there are only really kind of two southern states in addition to that have not passed those. And for our listeners in North Carolina and Georgia, if indeed your legislature and your governor decides to pass those, you can expect the same kind of firestorm perhaps to break out. Well, let me go to Cheryl in Texas, KAVX. And Cheryl has a little bit more she would like to share about Governor Hutchinson and what is happening in Arkansas. So, Cheryl, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kirby. I hope you're having a good day.
I am.
Good. That's great. I was very saddened and disappointed to learn that Mr. Hutchinson, whom, if I believe, and if I'm correct, is a born-again Christian, that he has, according to Weasel Zippers, a conservative website, kind of a news blog, he has declined to sign this because of his son Seth, because of his son's politics. So I did not know he had a son who was very liberal, but I guess he does. And I'm very disappointed to hear that he would put his son's politics over what is right.
Well, and again, I've seen this happen before. Again, you've mentioned one website. Let me mention one that probably most people consider just a little more reputable, and that would be the New York Times. And that's an article that came out today, Arkansas Governor's Son Thrust into Spotlight Over Religious Freedom. And it has to do that, indeed, he is the son of the governor and was arrested as for something. I forget what it was, but he was an art teacher, but he describes himself as a homosexual or as gay, and so I won't get into all the details. He's quite free to keep his own privacy, but the point I'm making is we have seen this, I think, sometimes before. I do not know if that's the reason. Right now, the governor, and I'll take his word at it, is simply saying we need to make some changes in the law. That is also what Mike Pence just said as the governor of Indiana. So it's possible it's just that. But it wouldn't surprise me if oftentimes people have one view of homosexuality, then if they have a family member as homosexual, they change their view. Just like I have heard lots of people that say they're pro-life until maybe their daughter gets pregnant, and then all of a sudden they have a different view of life. And that is understandable. Maybe I don't agree with it, but it is understandable. So, again, we know a little bit about the son, and maybe that tells us a little bit more. Any comments?
No, I guess that's disappointing still, though, because I've got relatives who don't do things or live the way the Bible says they should, but that doesn't mean that we don't stand up for what's right. So I guess that's all I have today. I was just sad.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And again, I point to the New York Times talking about that story as well. And some people are, maybe trying to read between the lines. My philosophy always around here is I'll take people at their word until they prove otherwise. And he's saying right now I'm looking for some changes in the law. Of course, we also heard Governor Mike Pence. Maybe he's just biding his time, recognizing that the moment he signs that, then, of course, all the protesters that are in Indianapolis will show up at Little Rock. So that is the case, perhaps, and there may be also some concerns about the way the law is written. But as I've pointed out before, even though I mentioned just a minute ago, a lot of these states that have passed Religious Freedom Restoration Acts tend to be in the Midwest or the South. There's some very significant exceptions in the West and exceptions even in the Northeast. So it's not necessarily one piece of legislation that was considered that radical. And interestingly enough, Arizona has something like a RFRA, but you might remember when the governor, Jan Brewer of Arizona, decided not to sign the updated law because she was threatened with whether or not the Super Bowl would be held in Arizona. And so once that threat was significant enough to back a governor down, I think it emboldened others. And if indeed the governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, does not sign that, I think that for a while it will be even more difficult for various state legislatures to pass some legislation like this, and even harder for some of the governors to sign it. So anyway, that's kind of where we find ourselves on that issue. And if you'd still like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I did want to come back to a couple of other issues that deserve your attention, and one of those that we haven't talked about too often but does need a little attention, and that has to do with Hillary Clinton's email controversy. We now know that there will be some testimony that she gives. We can go back and forth as to whether or not Trey Gowdy's decision to allow her to speak privately rather than in a public hearing under oath makes any kind of sense at all. But our friends at the National Review the other day collected the 5 worst Clinton email excuses. And I thought just briefly I would cover those because you can see that those who have been trying to apologize and defend Hillary Clinton haven't come up with exactly the best kind of excuses, and it might be a preview of coming attractions if indeed Hillary Clinton is the presumptive, and I think right now is the presumptive, Democratic nominee. You're going to hear a lot more of this, but one of those they called, quote, if Edward Snowden could hack into government emails, Hillary shouldn't be expected to bother trying to ensure the security of your communications. And that is Ed Rendell, who is the former governor of Pennsylvania, said, well, what's the point in one of these interviews? And matter of fact, you can go to National Review and watch the actual video. But on MSNBC, made a real point about the fact that, well, you know, after all, they've hacked into the government's emails, so why are we all upset about Hillary Clinton having emails on a private server? I think because even given the fact that sometimes things have been hacked into the government, that is a level of cybersecurity that is far beyond what anything Hillary Clinton would have had in her actual server in her basement. And the fact that we found out about her server in the first place came because hackers broke into it. But anyway, that's the first argument. Second one is, well, Hillary Clinton's just simply too old to be technologically savvy. And host Ed Schultz kind of got into that idea there. Modern technology is too much for people of her demographic. And that was one that even had, I think, some of the people around the table shaking their heads. A third one was just to draw attention to something else. It's called something, something Bush administration, something, something Iraq war. When in a tough spot, they said, Andrew Johnson said, never hurts to blame the Bush administration. It seems that is James Carville's strategy, and he tried to deflect questions about the former Secretary of State's email by conjuring the Iraq war and dismissing the New York Times reporting because that coverage was more than 10 years ago. And again, you have to roll your eyes on that one. But 2 more real quickly. Number 4, the Clinton rules, just as we had seen before. Another defense that comes from James Carville is kind of, well, we have one set of rules for everybody else, and we have a different set of rules for the Clintons. And that was actually said, interestingly enough, about how the media covers it. So he took that and turned it around. He said, you know, really the way the media covers Bill and Hillary Clinton is very different than the way they cover everybody else. And it sort of kind of nudge says, well, since they are getting so much more scrutiny, maybe we should let off on them, and kind of reinforces this idea that there's one set of rules for the Clinton family, never set for the others. And then the last one, well, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell did it. And that argument has shown up a number of times, but even the Washington Post, underline, even the Washington Post fact-checked what it called the misleading Democratic spin on that claim and gave it 3 Pinocchios. After all, Hillary Clinton came to the State Department at Foggy Bottom after email standards for archiving had long been established in the federal government. And unlike Condoleezza Rice, who hardly used any email during her tenure, or Colin Powell, who served in a position before standards had been clear-cut, it was very obvious what those standards are. As a matter of fact, as we've pointed out before, an individual in the State Department got in trouble for doing the very same thing Hillary Clinton was doing. So those are just a few of the worst Clinton email excuses. And if you watch television over the next few days, especially as she is to give some of her testimony, I suspect you'll hear some more of them. And I wanted to give you a real opportunity to understand how silly and eye-rolling some of those arguments are. We'll be back with your phone calls right after this.
Point of View, Truth Team 360, Rebecca Hagelin.
Point of View provides a combination of what is truly happening in public policy in the culture around the country and provides a worldview from which to judge what the believer should do about the culture and public policy. It's a critical source of information, inspiration, and also what possible action steps might be.
Point of View, Truth Team 360,
Talking about action steps. The action step today, of course, is to support religious freedom. Tomorrow we'll probably have a different one, so act on that one, and we'll give you some other possibilities where you can be involved. And again, we appreciate the good work that Rebecca Hagelin has done over the years, served for many years as the Vice President of Communications at the Heritage Foundation, a good friend and individual that has supported us in the past, and we encourage you to support us as well through Truth Team 360. I was going to bring something up, and I noticed that Nick on our line here is going to address that. So, Nick, calling in from South Carolina, I'll let you do the honors. Go for it.
Well, thank you, Kirby. What I'm calling about is I heard it on the radio today that said that a lot of this stuff that's going on up there, a lot of these emails and all this kind of stuff is actually caused by just a few people. And Rush was talking about his attacks, and he checked out and he found out that there was only about 10 people that were using all different kinds of addresses and all different kinds of stuff to try and get him off the air. And he said that he believed that this was the same situation up there. And behind this is George Soros. And I can't understand why some reporter couldn't get on all the stuff that he's done and attack him under the RICO law for all the hate and discontent and violence that he caused. He had over 30 different groups there in Ferguson stirring up hate and discontent and starting fires there.
Well, and if you want to see something about media bias, it is amazing how much the so-called mainstream and really liberal media talk about the Koch brothers. I actually go to various political events. I've never met these individuals, and the only time I ever heard them speak was one time when they were being interviewed on, I think it was a Barbara Walters special. So if these people are so nefarious, but because they support not necessarily always conservative groups, because they're more libertarian, so on some areas we wouldn't even necessarily agree with them. We hear all about the Koch brothers. We've heard Harry Reid when he was, and I guess still is, kind of in the Senate, but before when he was Senate Majority Leader, talking about the Koch brothers. We never hear anybody talking about George Soros unless you're listening to like a Rush Limbaugh or a Glenn Beck or something like that. I just think it illustrates the point. If there were conservative groups that were creating that amount of turmoil, and if they were actually manipulating social media to look larger than they were, we'd hear all about AstroTurf. This is not grassroots, it's all AstroTurf. But we know on the other side that that's exactly what's going on. It is a phony movement in many cases that has been made to look much larger than it really is, simply because those individuals have been able to master some computer techniques and make it look like thousands and thousands of people are upset with what is happening when it may be just a handful of people.
Yeah, well, that's it's just like the guy in charge or who's on the NRA who I can't think of his name. You'd know his name. It's a Norwegian sounding name, and his ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then he has ties with George Soros and Obama. And George Soros, it's almost like everything evil going on in this country he's behind it. He's made his millions by crashing economies and using Lewinsky tactics, top down, bottom up, inside out. And for that one guy, he got his boy Obama in office, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he donated money so that he would get the Peace Prize before he even became president.
Could be. Well, Nick, I appreciate your comments. And again, I just wanted to talk about the fact that there are, and I've written about this, I have commentaries on what are called the internet trolls. That's what they're sometimes called even in the business. So I'm not necessarily casting a name on them that hasn't been used by other individuals, but those are those that sort of sit, for example, on Wikipedia, and the first time you post something that they would disagree with, and they're lurking out there, looking at whether it's climate change articles or whether it's articles about homosexuality or whatever it might be. They also sometimes, even if you try to clarify your bio on Wikipedia, they'll change it right back as soon as you've said, well, now wait a minute, this is the truth and you're actually saying a lie about me. They'll drop the lie back in. And so there are groups that do that, and there are individuals, and it's a handful of individuals sometimes that have been able to make it look like thousands of people are protesting an issue. And so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the emails and other things that were sent to Governor Mike Pence came from just a handful of groups, a handful of individuals perhaps, to make it look like it's a nationwide outrage. And then, of course, they send that to various corporations who then repeat it again. And you got this echo chamber. And that's one of the reasons why we encourage you to listen to Point of View. So we'll tell you as best as we can what the truth is on those issues. I wish I had time for all the calls. You will be able to call me tomorrow, but let's, I guess, end with this call today from Lee in Georgia. You have the floor.
Hey, Kirby. Thank you for taking my call. Try to be really quick. Jesus told us that we were always going to be hated by the world. And this is just a real picture of it. This law was passed to protect all religions, but they're focusing on Christianity. They want to tear us down, but we have to stand there and be strong. And my question now really is, if these laws are in place in states where people have been brought to court and sued over their gentle refusal to, I mean, they're not getting in the faces of these homosexual couples and being vile and disgusting with them. They're just saying, dear heart, this goes against our belief in what Christ would have us do, and we just gently refuse. And then they're taken to court. If these laws are in place in these states, why aren't these laws called up to protect these people?
Well, and again, I've argued that sometimes if indeed you're going to use a hate crime to go against Christians, it cuts both ways. Couldn't use a hate crime in the other direction. And I think we maybe need to encourage some of our religious liberty groups to think about taking a case. Maybe it would have to be a really egregious example of where somebody has tried to drive someone into bankruptcy and say, we're going to file a countersuit for false charges and for damages and those kinds of things. So we'll see where that plays itself out, but it's certainly possible. You said something in passing that I do want to mention, and we're just simply out of time. Yesterday, I posted a piece, and I would really encourage you to read it. And so it'll be under yesterday's stories, but you can find it by going to shows and find it. 10 Americans helped by religious freedom bills like Indiana's. And to make the case that Lee just made, in every case, and I think that's partially because Molly Hemingway actually chose non-Christian examples, but nevertheless, every one of the 10 examples weren't even Christians that were benefiting. And we're talking about Muslims and Sikhs and Native American Indians and all sorts of things to illustrate, again, you just can't believe everything you see or hear from the mainstream media. We'll try to tell the truth, and that's why I'm encouraging you. If you haven't become a member, join with us. Truth Team 360, we have the information on our website, pointofview.net. Or, of course, you can simply go to pointofview.net/team. Would love to hear from you. Love for you to be a member. I'd love to send you a welcoming gift. Certainly, I want to encourage you to join with us. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris. We'll be back here tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. See you then.
Now, let me see if I can get this straight. Apple President Tim Cook, Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy, and countless others are calling for a boycott of Indiana, refusing to do business with the state, and that's good. But when a small business owner, because of a commitment to religious conviction, freedoms protected under the Constitution, chooses not to do business for a so-called gay wedding, that's something that should be prosecuted. Can anyone explain this to me? Some say Indiana Governor Mike Pence is caving in to pressure. Others, like Gary Bowers, say he's not. I don't know. What I do know is we need to pray for America. Would you agree? Join our Pray for America movement today by clicking into pointofview.net/pray. Sign up. We'll send you our free Pray for America booklet and prayer updates on things to pray for. America is in turmoil. God's people need to pray. Stand with us on our knees. Pray for Mike Pence. Pray for America. Pointofview.net/pray. Pointofview.net/pray.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.